The last light of Pine Ridge. The morning had started like any other in the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana. Sarah Chen adjusted her hiking boots one final time as she stood beside her beat-up Jeep Wrangler, the familiar scent of pine and mountain air filling her lungs. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore her favorite olive green field jacket, the same one she'd worn on dozens of wilderness photography expeditions over the past 5 years. "You sure about this route, Sarah?" Jake Morrison called out from behind her, shouldering his heavy backpack with a grunt. At 28, Jake was 2 years younger than Sarah, but his experience as a wilderness guide made him invaluable on these solo photography trips she'd started taking him on. His dark hair was already damp with sweat despite the cool October morning, and his weathered face showed the concern that had been nagging at him since she'd proposed this particular hike. "The Pine Ridge Trail system has been closed for maintenance since that storm last month," he continued, checking the straps on his pack for the third time. "Park rangers said some of the bridges got washed out, and there's been reports of unstable ground conditions." Sarah waved off his concerns with the confidence that had made her one of the most sought-after nature photographers in the Pacific Northwest. Her work had been featured in National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and countless travel publications. She'd captured images of grizzly bears in Alaska, scaled treacherous peaks in the Rockies, and spent weeks alone in the wilderness with nothing but her camera and survival skills. A little trail maintenance wasn't going to stop her from getting the shots she needed for her upcoming exhibition. "Jake, I've been hiking these mountains since I was 12 years old," she said, adjusting her camera bag and checking her GPS device. "My dad brought me up here every summer. I know every trail, every creek, every rock formation. Besides, that's exactly why we'll get the shots no one else can. We'll be the only ones out there." The autumn light filtering through the dense canopy of Douglas firs and western hemlocks was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for. Golden rays slanted through the trees at perfect angles, creating the kind of dramatic lighting that made outdoor photographers wake up at 4 a.m. and hike for hours into remote locations. The storm Jake had mentioned had actually worked in their favor. It had cleared out the underbrush and created interesting patterns of fallen logs and debris that would add texture and drama to her compositions. They'd been hiking for about 3 hours when Sarah first noticed the sound. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the crunch of their boots on the trail and Jake's occasional commentary about the terrain. But as they climbed higher into the Pine Ridge backcountry, the sound grew more distinct, a low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "You hear that?" Jake asked, stopping mid-stride and tilting his head to listen. His hand instinctively moved to the bear spray clipped to his belt, a habit developed over years of guiding tourists through predator country. Sarah paused, listening intently. The rumbling continued, punctuated by what sounded like the groaning of stressed timber and the distant crash of something heavy hitting the ground. "Probably just the forest settling after the storm," she said, though something in her gut told her it was more than that. "Trees fall all the time out here, especially after heavy weather. Remember that windstorm 3 years ago? We could hear trees coming down for days afterward." But Jake wasn't convinced. His experience in the mountains had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him they should turn around. "Sarah, I really think we should head back. This doesn't feel right. That storm was worse than anyone initially reported, and if the ground conditions are as unstable as the Park Service thinks." "We're fine, Jake." Sarah's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to making decisions in challenging situations. "We've come too far to turn back now, and the light is perfect. Look at this." She gestured toward a particularly stunning scene where sunlight was filtering through a grove of aspens, their yellow leaves creating a natural cathedral of golden green. "This is exactly what I need for the exhibition. My publisher is expecting these shots next week." They continued deeper into the wilderness, following what remained of the Pine Ridge Trail. The path, normally well maintained and clearly marked, showed obvious signs of storm damage. Fallen trees blocked sections of the trail, forcing them to navigate around massive trunks and through thick undergrowth. In several places, the trail itself had been washed away by flash flooding, leaving only faint traces in the mud to guide their way. Sarah was in her element, stopping frequently to capture images of the storm's aftermath, the way morning light played across a massive uprooted pine, the intricate patterns created by rushing water carving new channels through the forest floor, the dramatic angles of trees that had fallen like enormous pickup sticks across the landscape. Her camera clicked steadily as she worked, each shot carefully composed and considered. "These are going to be incredible," she called back to Jake, who was maintaining a constant scan of their surroundings. Years of guiding had taught him to always be aware of weather conditions, terrain changes, and potential hazards. Right now, everything about this place was setting off alarm bells in his head. It was just after noon when they heard the first major rumble. This time, there was no mistaking it for settling timber or distant rockfall. The sound came from directly beneath their feet, a deep, ominous groaning that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Sarah, who had been crouched beside a fallen log setting up a macro shot of mushrooms growing on the decaying bark, looked up with genuine concern for the first time all day. Okay, that's definitely not normal, she admitted, standing slowly and looking around at the trees surrounding them. Several of the larger pines were swaying slightly, despite the absence of any significant wind. Jake was already moving, his wilderness guide training taking over. We need to get to higher ground, now, he said, his voice calm but urgent. If this is what I think it is. He never got to finish the sentence. The rumbling intensified suddenly, and Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shift. At first, it was just a slight tremor, like the vibration from a passing freight train. But within seconds, the tremor became a violent shaking that threw both of them off balance. Landslide, Jake shouted over the growing roar. The whole hillside is going. Sarah's photographer instincts kicked in even as panic began to rise in her chest. She grabbed her camera bag and started running in the direction Jake was pointing, uphill, toward what appeared to be more stable ground. Behind them, the rumbling had become a deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them at once. The ground continued to shift and buckle beneath their feet as they ran. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries began to topple in slow motion, their massive root systems torn from the suddenly unstable earth. The very landscape was transforming around them, as decades of soil and rock began sliding downhill in a catastrophic mass movement triggered by the storm's saturation of the soil and the inherent instability of the steep terrain. This way, Jake yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward what looked like a stable rock outcropping about 50 yards uphill. If we can get to those rocks, we might be able to ride this out. They ran harder than either had ever run in their lives, dodging falling branches and leaping over newly formed cracks in the earth. Sarah's camera bag bounced against her hip, and she could hear her expensive lenses rattling inside, but that was the least of her concerns right now. Behind them, the landslide was gaining momentum, a massive wave of earth, trees, and debris that was consuming everything in its path. They were less than 20 yards from the rock outcropping when Sarah's foot caught on a root hidden beneath the forest debris. She went down hard, her ankle twisting painfully as she hit the ground. Her camera bag flew open, spilling thousands of dollars worth of equipment across the forest floor. Sarah, Jake turned back immediately, even as the roar of the landslide grew louder behind them. Can you move? My ankle, she gasped, trying to push herself up. Pain shot through her leg, and she collapsed back onto the muddy ground. I think it's broken. Jake, you have to go. Get to the rocks. Not happening, Jake said firmly. He grabbed her under the arms and started pulling her toward safety, but she was deadweight, and they were running out of time. The leading edge of the landslide was now visible through the trees, a churning mass of mud, rocks, and vegetation that was advancing toward them at frightening speed. Leave me, Sarah shouted, but Jake ignored her. Instead, he made a decision that probably saved both their lives. Rather than trying to drag her uphill to the rocks, he pulled her sideways, toward a massive fallen Douglas fir that had come to rest against several other trees, creating a natural shelter. Get under the log, he ordered, pushing her toward the space beneath the enormous trunk. It's our only chance. Sarah crawled under the log just as the landslide reached them. The world exploded into chaos, the deafening roar of moving earth, the crack and splinter of trees being snapped like toothpicks, the tremendous impacts of boulders rolling past just feet from where they huddled. The fallen log that sheltered them groaned and shifted under the assault, but it held. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they lay pressed together in their improvised shelter while the mountain collapsed around them. Mud and debris poured past the ends of the log, and several times Sarah was certain they were about to be buried alive. The air filled with dust and the smell of torn earth and broken vegetation. Then, gradually, the roar began to subside. The violent shaking stopped, the impacts of rolling boulders became less frequent, then ceased altogether. In the sudden quiet that followed, they could hear water running, a lot of water, flowing where no stream had existed before. Is it over? Sarah whispered. Jake listened carefully before responding. I think so, but we need to stay put for a while longer, make sure there aren't any secondary slides. They waited another 20 minutes before Jake finally crawled out from under the log to assess their situation. What he saw made his heart sink. The landscape around them had been completely transformed. Where there had once been a hiking trail winding through mature forest, there was now a massive scar of raw earth and debris. Trees that had been standing when they took shelter were gone, swept away by the slide or buried under. Tons of mud and rock. How bad is it? Sarah called out. She was still trapped under the log. Her injured ankle made it impossible for her to crawl out of the tight space without help. Bad, Jake said simply. He began digging at the debris that had piled up around the log, trying to clear enough space to help her out. The trail's gone, completely wiped out, and there's a new creek running where we were hiking an hour ago. It took him nearly an hour to excavate enough mud and debris to help Sarah out of their shelter. When she finally emerged, dirty and shaken, the full scope of their predicament became clear. They were stranded in the middle of a transformed landscape, miles from any road or established trail, with Sarah unable to walk on her injured ankle. My GPS, Sarah said suddenly, remembering the device clipped to her pack. She pulled it out hopefully, but the screen was cracked and dark. It had been damaged either in her fall or during the landslide. Jake checked his own GPS, but it was showing the same problem. Without clear satellite reception under the thick forest canopy and with their exact location now altered by the landslide, the devices were essentially useless. We need to get you some medical attention, Jake said, examining Sarah's ankle as best he could. It was badly swollen and already turning dark purple. But first, we need to figure out exactly where we are and find a way out of here. They spent the next several hours slowly working their way across the slide zone, looking for any recognizable landmarks or signs of the original trail system. Sarah had to lean heavily on Jake for support, making progress painfully slow. Her ankle throbbed with every step, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded from the pain and shock. There, Jake said finally, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation that rose above the tree line about a mile away. I remember that peak from the trail map. If we can get to the base of those rocks, I think I can get us oriented and find a route back to civilization. The journey to the rock formation took them the rest of the daylight hours. They had to navigate around washouts, climb over fallen trees, and ford the new stream that had been created by the landslide. Sarah's camera equipment was long gone, swept away in the chaos, but that seemed trivial compared to their current survival situation. As darkness began to fall, they finally reached the base of the rock formation. Jake helped Sarah find a comfortable place to rest against a boulder, then climbed partway up the rocks to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. What he saw from his vantage point was both encouraging and terrifying. He could see lights in the distance, the town of Cedar Falls, probably about 8 miles away as the crow flies. But between them and safety lay a maze of storm-damaged forest, unstable terrain, and at least 2 more major slide zones that appeared to have been triggered by the same conditions that had nearly killed them. "Can you see a way out?" Sarah called up to him. Jake climbed back down, his expression grim. "Yes and no. I can see the town, but getting there is going to be challenging. The whole mountainside is unstable. There are at least 2 more slide areas between us and safety, and with your ankle." "I can make it," Sarah said firmly, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "I have to make it. My exhibition opens in 6 days, and even without the photos, I need to be there." Jake looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Even in their current desperate situation, she was thinking about her work, her commitments, her professional obligations. It was the same drive and determination that had made her successful as a photographer, but right now it might be more liability than asset. "Sarah, we need to be realistic about this," he said gently. "It's going to take us at least 2 days to get out of here, maybe more. And that's assuming we don't run into any more unstable ground or bad weather. Your ankle needs proper medical treatment, and you're already showing signs of exhaustion." As if to emphasize his point, it began to rain, not the gentle mountain drizzle they were accustomed to, but a steady downpour that quickly soaked through their clothes and turned the already treacherous terrain even more slippery and dangerous. "We need shelter," Jake said, looking around at their exposed position. "There's a cave system in these rocks that I've used before when guiding groups. If I can find the entrance in this weather, we can ride out the rain and plan our route for tomorrow." It took him another hour of searching in the downpour, but Jake finally located the cave entrance, a narrow opening between 2 massive boulders that opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber. The cave was dry and showed evidence of previous use by hikers and climbers. There were even some emergency supplies cached in waterproof containers by previous visitors. Jackpot, Jake said, inventorying the supplies by flashlight. Water purification tablets, emergency food bars, a first aid kit, even a space blanket. Whoever left this cache probably saved our lives. Sarah was shivering uncontrollably by the time Jake got her settled in the cave and wrapped in the space blanket. Her ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and she was clearly running on adrenaline and determination alone. Jake used supplies from the first aid kit to create a makeshift splint and gave her some of the emergency pain medication he found in the cache. "Try to get some rest," he said, settling down beside her in the cave. "Tomorrow we start the journey out, but you're going to need all your strength." Sarah nodded, but sleep seemed impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the roar of the landslide, feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, see Jake risking his life to save hers when any rational person would have left her behind. "Jake," she said quietly in the darkness. "Thank you, for not leaving me back there. For getting us this far. I know this is my fault, if I hadn't insisted on coming out here." "Stop," Jake interrupted. "Natural disasters happen. We couldn't have predicted that landslide any more than we could have predicted an earthquake or a flash flood. What matters now is getting home safely." They talked quietly through the night, sharing stories and trying to keep their spirits up while the rain continued to fall outside their shelter. Jake told her about his childhood in Montana, his decision to become a wilderness guide after college, his dreams of eventually opening his own outdoor adventure company. Sarah shared her own story, growing up in Seattle, her early fascination with photography, the breakthrough assignment that had launched her career, and the constant pressure she felt to capture increasingly dramatic and remote subjects. "Sometimes I wonder if I pushed too hard," she admitted as dawn began to filter into the cave. "Always trying to get the shot that no one else can get, always looking for the next remote location, the next challenge. Maybe this was the universe's way of telling me to slow down. Or maybe it was just bad timing and worse luck," Jake replied pragmatically. "Don't read too much meaning into random events, Sarah. You're a professional who takes calculated risks to create amazing work. One bad day doesn't change that." By morning, the rain had stopped, and they could see clear skies through the cave entrance. Sarah's ankle was still painful, but the swelling had gone down slightly, and she felt more optimistic about their chances of making it out. Jake scouted ahead while Sarah prepared what remained of their supplies for the journey. From his reconnaissance, he'd identified what appeared to be a relatively stable route that would take them around the major slide zones and eventually connect with a Forest Service road about 6 miles away. "It's going to be slow going," he warned her. "But I think we can do it. The key is to stay away from any slopes that look saturated or unstable, and to move carefully. One more fall could be disastrous." They began their descent at mid-morning, with Sarah using a makeshift crutch Jake had fashioned from a sturdy branch. The going was indeed slow, they had to stop frequently for rest, and several times they had to backtrack when the terrain proved too difficult for Sarah to navigate with her injury. But gradually, they made progress. By afternoon, they could hear the distant sound of traffic on the Forest Service road. By evening, they emerged from the forest onto the gravel road, dirty, exhausted, but alive. A Forest Service patrol truck found them just as the sun was setting, and within 2 hours they were at the medical center in Cedar Falls, where X-rays confirmed that Sarah had suffered a severe sprain but no broken bones. As she sat in the emergency room waiting for her discharge papers, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 2 days. She had lost thousands of dollars worth of camera equipment, missed the shots she'd traveled so far to capture, and nearly lost her life in the process. But she had also been reminded of something important: the value of human connection, of having someone willing to risk everything to help when it mattered most. "The exhibition," she said suddenly to Jake, who was sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed. "Will happen," Jake replied firmly. "Maybe not with the shots you originally planned, but it will happen. You've got 5 years worth of incredible work to choose from." Sarah smiled, realizing he was right. In her obsession with capturing the perfect new images, she had forgotten about the hundreds of amazing photographs she'd already taken, the portfolio of work that had established her reputation in the first place. "You know what," she said, "I think I'm going to call this exhibition, Survived, instead of Untamed. It seems more appropriate somehow." Jake laughed. "I like it, and for what it's worth, I think this whole experience will make your next work even better." Nothing changes perspective like facing your own mortality in the wilderness. As they left the hospital and drove back toward Sarah's hotel, the lights of Cedar Falls looked brighter and more welcoming than any city lights she could remember. Sometimes, she realized, the most important shots weren't the ones you captured with a camera, but the ones that captured you, the moments that changed how you saw the world and your place in it. The landslide had taken her equipment and nearly taken their lives, but it had also given her something valuable in return, a reminder of what truly mattered, and the beginning of what she suspected would be a lifelong friendship forged in the crucible of survival.